Good morning. Welcome back to Burning Bridge. We last left them. They Will and Evelyn are captured by the Scandians, right? Horace went back to the kingdom to alert everybody. And here we go. Will's head ached abominably. A constant rhythmic thudding pounding through his skull, setting flashes off behind his tight-closed eyes. He forced his eyes open and found himself staring close range at a sheepskin vest in the back of a pair of leather-bound woolen leggings. The world was upside down, and he realized he was being carried over someone's shoulder. The thudding was the sound of the man's feet as he jogged along. Will wished he would walk. He groaned aloud, and the jogging stopped. "Iraq!" the man carrying him called. "He's awake!" And so saying, the Scandian lowered him to the ground. Will tried to take a pace, but his knees gave out, and he sank to his haunches. Eric, the leader of the group, leaned down now and examined him. One thick thumb caught hold of his eyelid, and he felt his eye being opened wide. The man wasn't cruel, but he was none too gentle either. Will recognized him now as the Scandian who had come so close to discovering him when he was eavesdropping by their campfire in the valley. He said thoughtfully. "Concussed, most likely. That was a good throw with that rock, Nordahl," he said to one of the others. The Scandian he had spoken to, a giant of a man with his blond hair and two tightly plaited braids that were greased so they were swept upward like horns, smiled at the praise. "Grew up hunting seals and penguins that way, I did," he said, with some satisfaction. Iraq released Will's eyelid and moved away. Now, Will felt a gentler touch on his face, and opening his eyes again, found himself looking into Evelyn's eyes. She stroked his forehead gently, trying to clean away the dried, matted blood there. "Are you all right?" she said, and he nodded, then realized that was not a good idea. "Fine," he managed, fighting back a wave of nausea. They got you as well?" he added, unnecessarily, and she nodded. "Horace?" he said softly, and she put a finger to her lips. "He got away," she whispered. "I saw him running when the bridge collapsed." Will sighed with relief. "We did it then. We got the bridge." This time it was Evelyn's turn to nod. A smile even touched her lips at the memory of the bridge crashing into the depths of the fissure. "It's gone," she said, "well and truly." Eric heard the last few words. He shook his head at them. "And no thanks you'll get from Morgorath for that," he told them. Will felt a small chill of fear at the mention of the Lord of Rain and Night's name. Here on the plateau it seemed somehow more ominous, more dangerous, altogether more malevolent, whatever. The Scandian glanced at the sun. "We'll take a break," he said. "Maybe our friend here will be up to walking in an hour or so." The Scandians opened their packs and produced food and drink. They tossed a water bottle and a small loaf of bread to Will and Evelyn, and the two ate hungrily. Evelyn began to say something, but Will raised a hand to hush her. He was listening to the Scandians' conversation. "So what do we do now?" asked the one called Nordahl. Eric chewed a piece of dried cod and washed it down with a gulp of the fiery liquid he carried in a leather bottle and shrugged. "For mine, we got out of here as fast as we can," he said. "We only came for the booty, and there's going to be precious little of that now that the bridge is gone." "Morgorath won't like it if we pull out," warned a shorter, heavily built member of the party. Eric simply shrugged. "Horik, I'm not here to help Morgorath take over Arielon," he replied. "Neither are you. We fight for profit, and when there's no profit to be had, I say we go." Horik looked down at the ground between his feet and scratched in the dust with his fingers. He didn't look up when he spoke again. "What about those two?" he said, and Will heard a sharp intake of breath from Evelyn as she realized the Scandian meant her and Will. "We take 'em with us," said Eric, and this time Horik looked up from the dust where he was drawing senseless patterns. "What good are they to us? Why shouldn't we just hand them over to the Wargles?" he asked, and the others mumbled their agreement. It was obviously a question that had been on their minds. They'd simply been waiting for someone else to bring it up. "I'll tell you," said Eric. "I'll tell you what good they are to us. First and foremost, they're hostages, aren't they?" Hostages, snorted the fourth member of the group, the one who so far hadn't spoken. Eric rounded upon him. That's right, Svengal, he told him. They're hostages. Now, I've been on more raids and on more campaigns than any of you, and I don't like the way this one's shaping up. Seems to me like Morgrath's been getting too clever for his own good. All this leaking false plans and building secret tunnels and planning surprise attacks with Horst and his men coming around Thorntree Forest, it's too complicated. And complicated isn't the way to go when you're facing people like the Arielons. Horth can still attack around the Thorntree, said Svengal stubbornly, but Eric was shaking his head. He can, but he won't know that the bridge is gone, will he? He'll be expecting support that will never come. I'll wager Morgrath won't hurry to tell him. He knows Horth would give it all away if he found out. Let me tell you, it'll be the toss of a coin to see which way that battle goes. That's the problem with these clever plans. You take away one element, and the whole thing can come crashing down. There was a short silence while the other Scandians thought about what he had said. A few heads nodded in agreement, and Eric continued. I'll tell you, boys, I don't like the way things are shaping, and I say we should take the chance to get to horse ships through the fens. Why not go back the way we came? Asked Svengal, but his leader shook his head emphatically. And try to get down those cliffs again with Morgrath after us? He asked. No, thank you. I don't think he'd take too kindly to deserters. We'll go along with him as far as the three-step pass. Then once we're in the open, we'll head east for the coast. He paused to let this sink in. And we'll have these two as hostages in case the Arielons try to stop us, he added. They're kids, said Nordal decisively. What use are they as hostages? Didn't you see that oak leaf amulet the boy was wearing? Eric asked, and instinctively Will's hand went to the oak leaf on the thong around his neck. That's the ranger's symbol, Eric continued. He's one of them, maybe some kind of trainee, and they look after their own. What about the girl? Said Svengal. She's no ranger. That's right, Eric agreed. She's just a girl. But I'm not handing any girl over to the Wargles. You've seen what they're like. They're worse than animals, that lot. She comes with us. There was another moment's silence as the others considered his words. Then Horik spoke. Fair enough, he agreed. Eric looked around at the others and saw that Horik had spoken for them all. The Scandians were warriors and hard men, but they weren't totally ruthless. Good, he said. Now let's get on the road again. He rose and moved toward Will and Evelyn while the other Scandians repacked the remains of the brief meal. Can you walk? He asked Will. Or does Nordal have to carry you again? Will flushed angrily and rose quickly to his feet. Instantly, he wished he hadn't. The ground heaved and his head swam. He staggered, and only Evelyn's firm hand on his arm prevented him from falling. But he was determined not to show weakness in front of his captors. He steadied himself, then glared defiantly at Eric. I'll walk, he managed to say, and the big Scandian studied him for a moment, an apprising look on his face. Yes, he said finally. I dare say you will. All right, chapter 28. Battlemaster David chewed the ends of his mustache as he frowned at the plan outlined on the sand table. I don't know, Halt, he said doubtfully. It's very risky. One of the first principles of warfare is never to split your forces. Halt nodded. He knew the knight's criticism was intended to be constructive, not simply negative thinking. It was Sir David's role to find any faults in the plan and weigh them against its possible advantages. That's true, the ranger replied, but it's also true that surprise is a powerful weapon. Baron Tyler walked around the table considering the plan from another viewpoint. He pointed with his dagger at the mass of green that represented the Thorntree Forest. You're sure you and Galan can guide a large cavalry force through the Thorntree? I thought nobody could get through there, he asked dubiously. And Halt nodded. The Rangers have charted and surveyed every inch of the kingdom for years, my lord, he told the Baron. Especially the parts people think there's no way through. We can surprise this northern force. Then Morgrath will be caught out as well, when no Scandians turn up behind us. Tyler continued to pace around the table, staring intently at the designs drawn there and the markers set in place in the sand map. All the same, he said, We'll be in a pretty scrape if the Scandians defeat Halt and the cavalry over here in the north. After all, you'll be outnumbered almost 2-1. Halt nodded agreement again. That's true, but we'll catch them in open country, so we'll have the advantage. And don't forget, we'll be taking 200 archer units as well. They should even the numbers a little. An archer unit consisted of 2 men, 1 archer and 1 accompanying spearman, mutually supporting each other. Against lightly armored infantry, they were a deadly combination, able to cut down large numbers at a distance, then retreat before their enemy could come to grips with them. But, insisted Baron Tyler, let's assume that the Scandians do manage to win through. Then the tables will be turned. We'll be fighting a real enemy in the northwest with our rear exposed to Morgarath's wargles coming out of the pass. Harold managed to suppress a sigh. As a strategist, Tyler was notoriously cautious. On the other hand, he said, doing his best to keep the impatience out of his voice, if Halt succeeds, it will be his force that Morgarath sees coming around from the northwest. He'll assume it's the Scandians attacking us from that direction, and he'll bring his forces out onto the plains to attack us from behind. And then we'll have him, once and for all. The prospect seemed to appeal to him. It's still a risk, Tyler said stubbornly. Halt and Harold exchanged a glance, and the Baron's shoulders lifted slightly in a shrug. Halt said in a dry tone, All warfare has a risk attached to it, sir. Otherwise it would be easy. Baron Tyler looked up angrily at him. Halt met his gaze evenly. As the Baron opened his mouth to say something, Sir David forestalled him, smacking 1 gauntlet into his palm in a decisive gesture. All right, Halt, he said. I'll put your plan to the king. At the mention of the king, Halt's face softened slightly. How is his majesty's taking the news? He asked, and Sir David shrugged unhappily. Personally, he's devastated, of course. It was the cruelest possible blow to have his hopes raised and then shattered again. But he manages somehow to put his personal life to one side and continue to perform his duties as king. He says he'll mourn later, when it is all over. There may be no need for mourning, Harold put in, and David smiled sadly at him. I've told him that, of course. He says he'd prefer not to have false hopes raised once more. Remember, it's false hopes about his daughter. There was an awkward silence in the tent. Tyler, Fergus, and Sir David felt deep sorrow for their king. Duncan was a popular and just monarch. Halt and Baron Harold, on the other hand, both felt the loss of Will deeply. In a remarkably short time, Will had become an integral part of the Castle Redmond. Finally, it was Sir David who broke the silence. Gentlemen, perhaps you might begin preparing your orders. I'll take this plan to the king. And as he turned away to the intersections of the pavilion, the barons and Halt left the large tent. Harold, Fergus, and Tyler walked quickly away to prepare movement orders for the army. Halt, seeing a dejected figure in ranger green and gray waiting by the sentry post, moved down the small hill to talk to his former apprentice. I want to leave to go across the fissure after them, said Galan. Halt knew how deeply he felt the hurt of Will's loss. Galan blamed himself for leaving Will alone in the hills of Celtica. No matter how many times Halt and the other rangers told him that he had taken the right course, he refused to believe it. Now, Halt knew it. Now, Halt knew it would hurt him even more to be refused. Nevertheless, as rangers, their first duty was to the kingdom. He shook his head and answered curtly, Not granted. You're needed here. We're to lead a force through the thorn tree to cut off Horth's men. Go to Crowley's tent and get hold of the charts showing the secret ways for this part of the country. Galan hesitated, his jaw set. But, he began to protest, and then something in Halt's eyes stopped him as the older ranger leaned forward. Galan, do you think for 1 moment that I don't want to tear that plateau apart stone by stone until I find him? But you and I took an oath when they gave us these silver oak leaves, and now we have to live up to it. Galan dropped his eyes and nodded. His shoulders slumped as he gave in. All right, he said in a broken voice, and Halt thought he saw traces of tears in his eyes. He turned away hurriedly before Galan could see the moisture in his own. Get the charts, he said briefly. The 4 Scandians and their prisoners had trudged across the bleak, windswept plateau for the rest of the day and into the evening. It wasn't until several hours after dark that Eric called a halt, and Will and Evelyn sank gratefully to the rocky ground. The ache in Will's head had receded somewhat through the day, but it still throbbed dully in the background. The dried blood on the wound where the jagged rock had hit him itched abominably, but he knew that if he scratched it at the irritation, he would only open the wound up again and set the blood flowing once more. At least, thought Will, Eric hadn't kept them tied or restrained in any way. As a Scandian leader put it, there was nowhere for the two prisoners to run. "This plateau is full of wargles," he told them roughly. "You can take your chances with them if you choose." So they'd kept their position in the middle of the party, passing bands of wargles throughout the day and heading constantly to the northeast and Three-Step Pass. Now, the four Scandians eased their heavy packs to the ground, and Nordahl began to gather wood for a fire. Svengal tossed a large copper pot at Evelyn's feet and gestured toward a stream that bubbled through the rocks close by. "Get some water," he told her gruffly. For a moment the girl hesitated, and then she shrugged, took up the pot, and rose, groaning softly as her tired muscles and joints were called upon once more to take her weight. "Come on, then, Will," she said casually. "You can give me a hand." Eric was rummaging in his open pack. His head snapped around as she spoke. "No!" he said sharply, and the entire group turned to look at him. He pointed one blunt forefinger at Evelyn. "You! I don't mind wandering off," he said, "because I know you'll come back. But as for that ranger, he might just take it into his head to make a run for it, in spite of things." Will, who had been thinking of doing just that, tried to look surprised. "I'm no ranger," he said. "I'm just an apprentice." Eric gave a short snort of laughter. "You may say so," he replied, "but you dropped them wargles at the bridge as well as any ranger might. You stay where I can keep an eye on you." Will shrugged, smiled wanly at Evelyn, and sat back down, sighing as he leaned his back up against a rock. In a few moments, he knew it would become hard and knobby and uncomfortable, but right now, it was bliss. The Scandians went ahead making camp. In short order, they had a good fire going, and when Evelyn returned with a pot full of water, Eric and Svengal produced dried provisions, which they added to the water as it heated to make a stew. The meal was plain and fairly tasteless, but it was hot, and it filled their bellies. Will thought ruefully for a few moments of the pre-prepared food that came from Master Chubb's kitchen. Sadly, he realized that such thoughts of Master Chubb's kitchen and his times in the forest with Halt were no more than memories now, and the meal was suddenly even more tasteless than before. Evelyn seemed to sense his deepening sadness. He felt her warm, small hand cover his, and he knew she was looking at him. But he couldn't meet those vivid green eyes with his own, feeling the tears welling up in them. "It'll be all right," she whispered. He tried to talk, but couldn't form the words. Silently, he shook his head, his eyes downcast, staring intently at the scratched surface of the wooden bowl the Scandians had given him to use. They were camped some meters from the side of the road at the top of the slight rise. Eric had stated that he liked to see anyone who might choose to approach. Now, rounding a bend in the road several hundred meters away, came a large group of horsemen, followed by a troop of wargles, running to keep up with their horses' trot. The sound of the wargles' chant came to them on the breeze once more, and Will felt the hairs on the back of his neck rising. Eric turned swiftly to the two of them, gesturing them back into the cover of the rocks behind their campsite. "Quick, you two! Behind them rocks if you value your lives. That's Morgorath himself, and on the white horse. Nordahl, Horak, move into the light to screen them." Will and Evelyn needed no second bidding. Staying low, they scrambled into the cover provided by the rocks. As Eric had commanded, two of the Scandians stood and moved into the glare of the firelight, drawing the attention of the approaching riders away from the two small figures in the half-light. The chant, mingled with the clatter of hooves and the chink of harness and weapons, came closer as Will lay on his stomach, one arm covering Evelyn in the darkness. As he had done before, he scooped the hood of his cloak over his head to leave his face in deep shadow. There was a tiny gap between two of the rocks, and knowing he was taking a terrible risk but unable to resist, he pressed his eye into it. The view was restricted to a few meters of space. Eric stood on the far side of the fire, facing the approaching riders. Will realized that by doing so, he had placed the glare of the firelight between the new arrivals and the spot where he and Evelyn lay hidden. If any of the wargles looked in their direction, they would be staring straight into the bright firelight. It was a lesson in tactics he filed away for future reference. The sounds of horses and men stopped. The wargle chant died abruptly. For a second or two, there was silence. Then a voice spoke. A low voice with a slight snake-like sibilance to it. "Captain Eric, where are you bound?" Will glued his eye to the crack in the rocks, straining to see the speaker. Without a doubt, that cold, malevolent, I can never say that, voice had to belong to Morgorath. The sound of it was a sound of ice and hatred. The sound of nails scraping on tile. The blood ran cold to hear it, and beneath his hand, he felt Evelyn shiver. If it had a similar effect on Eric, however, he showed no sign of it. "My title, Lord Morgorath," he said evenly, "is not captain, but Jarl." "Well, then," replied the cold voice, "I must try to remember that, in case it is ever of the slightest interest to me. Now, captain," he said, laying stress on the title this time, "I repeat, where are you bound?" There was a jingle of harness, and through the crack in the rocks, Will saw a white horse move forward. Not a glossy-coated, shiny white horse, such as gallant knights might ride, but a pale horse without sheen or life to its coat. It was huge, dead white, and with wild, rolling eyes. He craned slightly to one side and managed to make out a black-gloved hand holding the reins loosely. He could see no more of the rider. "We thought we'd join your forces at Three-Step Pass, my lord," Eric was saying. "I assume you will go ahead with your attack, even though the bridge is down." Morgorath swore horribly at the mention of the bridge. Sensing his fury, the white horse sidestepped a few paces, and now Will could see the rider. Immensely tall but thin, he was dressed all in black. He stooped in the saddle to talk down to the Scandians, and the hunched shoulder and his black coat gave him the look of a vulture. The face was thin, with a beak of a nose and high cheekbones. The skin on the face was white and pallid, like the horse. The hair above it was long, set to frame a receding hairline, and white blonde in color. By contrast, the eyes were black pools. He was clean-shaven, and his mouth was a thin red slit in the pallor of his face. As Will looked, the Lord of Rain and Night seemed to sense his presence. He looked up, casting his gaze beyond Eric and his three companions, searching into the darkness behind them. Will froze, barely daring to breathe as those black eyes searched the night. But the light of the fire defeated Morgorath, and he returned his gaze to Eric. "Yes," he replied, "the attack will go ahead. Now that Duncan has his own forces deployed in what he thinks is a strong defensive position, he'll allow us to come out into the plains before attacking. At which point, Horth will take him in the rear," Eric put in, and with a chuckle, Morgorath stared at him, and head slightly to one side of as he considered him. Again, the bird-like pose made Will think of a vulture. "Exactly," he agreed. "It would be preferable if there were 2 flanking forces as I had planned originally, but 1 should be enough." "My thoughts too, my lord," Eric agreed, and there was a long moment of silence. Obviously, Morgorath had no interest in whether Eric agreed with him or not. "Things would be easier if your other countrymen had not abandoned us," Morgorath said eventually. "I've been told that your compatriot Olvak has sailed back to Scandia with his men. I had planned that they should come up the southern cliffs to reinforce us." Eric shrugged, refusing to take blame for something outside his sphere of influence. "Olvak is a mercenary," he said. "You can't trust mercenaries. They fight only for profit." "And you don't?" the toneless voice said with scorn. Eric squared his shoulders. "I'll honor my undertaking I've made," he said stiffly. Morgorath stared at him again for a long, silent moment. The Scandian met his gaze, and finally it was Morgorath who looked away. "Chirath told me you took a prisoner at the bridge, a mighty warrior," he said. "I don't see him." Again, Morgorath tried to look through the light into the further gloom. Eric laughed harshly. If Chirath was the leader of your wargulls, neither did he replied sarcastically. "He spent most of the time at the bridge, cowering behind a rock and dodging arrows." "And the prisoner?" Morgorath asked. "Dead," Eric replied. "We killed him and threw him over the edge." "A fact that displeases me intensely," Morgorath said, and Will felt his flesh crawling. I would have preferred to make him suffer for interfering in my plans. You should have brought him to me. And we would have preferred it if he hadn't been whipping arrows at our ears. The only way to take him was to kill him. Another silence as Morgreth considered the reply. Apparently, it was not satisfactory to him. Be warned for the future. I did not approve of your actions. This time it was Eric who let the silence stretch. He shrugged his shoulders slightly, as if Morgreth's displeasure was a matter of absolutely no interest to him. Eventually, the Lord of Rain and Night gathered his reins and shook them, heeling his horse savagely to turn it away from the campfire. I'll see you at Three-Step Pass, Captain, he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, he turned his horse back. And, Captain, don't get any ideas about deserting. You'll fight with us to the end. Eric nodded. I told you, my lord. I'll honor my bargains I've made. This time Morgreth smiled, a thin movement of the red lips in the lifeless white face. Be sure of it, Captain, he said softly. Then he shook the reins and his horse turned away, springing to a gallop. The wargles followed, the chant starting up again and ringing through the night. Will realized that behind the rocks he had been holding a giant breath. He let it go now and heard a corresponding sigh of relief from the Scandians. My god of battles, said Eric. He doesn't half give me the creeps, that one. Looks like he's already died and gone, put in Svengal, and the others nodded. Eric walked around the fire now and stood over where Will and Evelyn were still crouched behind the rocks. You heard that, he said, and Will nodded. Evelyn remained crouching, face down behind the rock. Eric stirred her roughly with the toe of his boot. What about you, Missy? He said with his voice harsh. You heard that, too? Now she looked up, tears of terror staining tracks in the dust on her face. Wordlessly she nodded. Eric fixed her gaze with his own until he was sure the threat was fully understood. Then remember it if you start thinking about escape, he said coldly. That's all that awaits you if you get away from us. Dun, dun, dun. That'll do it for now. Have a good day.